Excellent. So we started to look at agreement maps as we finished up our look at ecosynomics as a way of using the 4 lenses instead of 4 questions to look back at our experience. So what I'll show you is a tool that we developed. We call it the Agreements Evidence Map, or short for the Agreements Map, and how to develop one, and really getting a sense of why we would use it and how we could start to use it. So basically we're going to start with the experience. So remember, the key point of seeing the 4 lenses instead of 4 questions is always come back to our own experience. And the way we looked at the experience from the very first chapter that we started to synthesize with the 3 levels of perceived reality in chapter 2 was to have that 3-circle diagram with the 5 relationships. To be able to put words in it, because it's kind of clumsy to do that on circles, we created a table, and the table we had created had the 5 levels. The 3 levels of perceived reality and the 5 relationships. And now, so we've seen this graphic before. Now what we want to do is to take those 4 lenses and start to see what happens when we shine them back into our experience. Again, the big intention and insight here was when we looked at them as 4 separate questions in a linear process of what inputs do I have, what are the allocation mechanisms, or how do we transform stuff, and what is value. We saw those as 4 separate questions that people were asking that weren't related. Now we're suggesting that they're actually 4 experiences or lenses looking back into our experience. So to do that, we're going to add another dimension to this graphic, to look back on this graphic. And that's a little clumsy, and I apologize for that. And in here, we're now taking the 4 lenses. All right. So again, the idea, and I know we're getting into complexity because now we've got this 3-dimensional graphic, but we're taking the 5-dimensional, or the 5 by 3 table, and we're going to say, what does it look like when we look at that through the resources lens, through the allocation mechanism lens, through the value lens, and the organization lens? What we see through the lens in these 5 by 3 of our experience, which is really just a 3-circle graph. Now, to try to write over in here is a little complicated, and we have this issue of now we've got 5 by 3 by 4, so that's 60 different little squares that we're going to have to try to fill in, or 15 by 4 is 60, right? So 60 squares, and that's just too complex, and we'd have to be writing inside squares and tables and cubes, and that's confusing. So to try to simplify this, I'm going to redraw, but now just looking at this face of this whole diagram. with the 3 levels of reality. And the point I want you to get clear and to make here is that we're going to start writing in this diagram, which I'm going to call now the agreements map. And we'll remember that that is just short for the agreements evidence map, because what we're looking for is what evidence do I see when I look through this lens, which is this direction on our own experience, across the 5 relationships and 3 levels. And we're going to do that for each of these lenses. Now, the challenge is to be able to look at our agreements. And again, we've called this the agreements map. Because what we're going to try to end up with is what is the level of agreements and what kinds of structures and processes and practices are in the agreements that we make at these different levels of reality as we see these processes, these structures, these practices through these 4 lenses. So what becomes critical is to be able to see what each of these lenses can show us of those processes, those agreements, those practices. So let's remember what we're trying to do with this exercise. Because there's a lot of data on a lot of things that we could do with this, but what is the intention? The intention is to start saying from our own experience of the low to high vibrancy that we express in these 5 relationships in the 3-circle diagram, what processes, structures, practices, or agreements support that experience that we're having so that we can start to see what agreements there are there and which ones can we shift and how do we need to shift them to have a different experience. So the agreements are leading to the experience we're having. So here what we're trying to see is instead of 4 separate questions, we actually have 4 lenses that help us see a very comprehensive way of looking at what we're doing and what we're experiencing to see where these agreements are. And those are very, as we saw, 4 very big questions. So we want to ask these questions or look through these lenses at our experience to see what it shows us about our agreements. The reason that's important is because what we're trying to do is to get a very synthesized, higher level view of what's going on. And now we have 4 lenses that we can use to focus on different dimensions or ways of relating to this experience in all of this complexity in a relatively simplified way. So we're not looking at having to fill in a lot of detail on 60 boxes. Really trying to say, what do we see when we look through the resources lens at all 5 relationships at these 3 levels, and how do we summarize that here? What that will show us, and there are plenty of examples throughout the book, is that you'll see that there really isn't, in some groups, that, for example, in our experience, we said we're over towards the low vibrancy or very exhausting, and we describe that in the inner circle of the 3 circles, we'll see that that corresponds very strongly to really living out of thinking at the things level. So when we look through the resource lens, allocation lens, the value lens, and the organization lens, they're all going to give us insights into that even across all 5 relationships, the focus, the artifacts, the evidence is really at this level, and there isn't really much evidence at these other levels. One of the cool things that we found is that when you look at middle circle groups that are medium vibrancy in your experience, that when you look through these 4 lenses, you see a lot of evidence of development over time and things, outcomes, the ability to manifest that development. And that outer circle shows that they are very able to work, when we look through these 4 lenses, we'll see a lot of evidence of working at the possibility and development and things level across all 5 relationships. So what we want to do here is capture these in a way that can start to show, is there evidence for the existence of any of these at these levels, and what do we see when we look across the whole thing?